Good morning. So my talk used to be titled The Quad Game Collaborative Narrative Design in a Massive Multi-Authored IF Sandbox. And for various reasons, I can't just launch into that talk. It's not really possible to do that, to go on with life as usual today, without acknowledging what's happening all around us. These are terrible times for our country, but for people of color, times have always been terrible. It's just that that terribleness has not been acknowledged, or it has been denied, or it has been justified. So you may or may not know that there is a national media blackout event going on today, Blackout Tuesday. Some of our speakers may decide that they're going to participate in that, and so they won't be speaking in their scheduled slot. Other speakers are going to be speaking. We, speaking now not for myself, but for the NarraScope Conference Committee, respect and support what our speakers choose. Any actions that we can take individually and collectively to support people of color right now, recognizing that in some sense they're all inadequate, but any actions that we take to help the activism that's happening nationally or in our own local areas, we support. And we would like to invite you to the Discord today for a conversation about what specific steps we could take, specific actions we could take that might involve contributing to bail funds. And I think some of those links will be made available in the Discord. To amplifying Black voices, to strategizing ways that we can diversify our organization and our community. How can we be more welcoming to people of color? How can we amplify Black voices, Black games, Black game design? So there are actions we can take beyond participating specifically in this blackout. There are a diverse set of feelings about the blackout itself, about its usefulness. And it's not up to us to judge those, but just to support actions people wish to take. Likewise, participants in our conference may choose not to listen to sessions today, and others will. And we likewise respect and support your choices in this regard without judgment. So feel free to turn me off and go to the Discord and get involved in these really important conversations. So I've decided to go on with my talk, partly because I was able to change my talk a little bit, maybe to be appropriate for the day. So if my slides are out of order or are in a little disrepair, I was up really late, and I ask please for your forgiveness on that. So what my talk is going to be is more of a reflection on why it's important to teach game design for a lot of reasons. So let's just jump into this, and I'm going to do my best here. So I want to start out by talking a little bit about play, free play, how we play when we're kids. It's creative and it's collaborative and it's improvisational. It may be bounded by norms, but not necessarily by rules. So I played a lot of hot lava as a kid. I had a swing set in the backyard, and you had to stay on it and climb on it like a monkey because the ground was hot lava. And I remember as a kid being amazed that every kid seemed to know how to play hot lava, and a lot of other kids' games. It goes into culture, how we play those games. And there are norms of play, but so much role play in it that they would move and shift. There were no rules per se. When we establish rules, free play can become a game. So I've never actually played this hot lava game, but the image is pretty cool. You make a game about a free play, and the endless horizon of free play is replaced by boundaried spaces. Sometimes we refer to those spaces as magic circles. I'm not going to get into sort of the theory of gaming because I'm more interested in the rules. So this is how I would say it to my students. You can tell this is a slide I took from a presentation to my students. That game spaces and the rules governing play are shaped by our narratives, our social relations, and they enable certain cognitive skills and socio-technical practices. Playing games are complicated. Just like structural inequalities in the real world, the context, the historical and the social and the cultural context of the narratives, relations, skills, and practices that are behind our games are often invisible. They're meant to be invisible. They're black boxed into our games. They are visible to the game designers, to committed fans who study the design, and to literary critics whose job it is to look for that cultural content in what we make, in the games we make and play. So for a minute, I want to talk about Dodgeball, the venerable gym class game, right? And gym teachers love Dodgeball. Teaches hand-eye coordination, balance, and supposedly it teaches good sportsmanship. That's an image of Dodgeball from my childhood there. Now, the ball-throwing child who's not on the screen is having a lot of fun, is practicing hand-eye coordination and balance. And the kid in the corner is practicing good sportsmanship. Well, but fun, really not so much. The way I read Dodgeball is that the game allows bullies to touch him without consent, right? Bullies can hurt other kids with complete deniability and no consequences. And if you get hit by a ball and you cry, or you object to how hard you were hit or where you were hit, you're not being sportsmanlike, you're even a loser, right? Complain that it hurt, try to leave the game and you're a wimp, or, other worse words. It's interesting to look into the origin of Dodgeball. And I know some people who love Dodgeball feel like they want to defend it, okay? But let's just look at the history. A missionary, Christian missionary named James H. Carlisle, who was a missionary to Africa, claimed to have witnessed a blood sport version of the game, Dodgeball to the death. And he brought this game back to England, replaced what he said were sharpened rocks, leather ball. And some people have questioned whether this story is true. However, if you look at Dodgeball sites on the internet, you'll see that they all harken back to that story. So it doesn't actually matter if the story is true, because the narrative of that is at work in the way the game is understood and played. So the origin myth creates rules guided by an explicit narrative that's about aggression and victimhood, right? So when you play Dodgeball, and if you get hit or hurt, you know that you're going to have your turn, and when it's your turn, you're supposed to get revenge. You're going to throw that ball really hard at the people who threw the ball at you, right? So the narrative or that story says, oh, you don't have to be a victim, you can be the bully instead, right? And that whole story, that narrative of revenge, is framed as desirable and as fun. But this is the thing, and this is the point of my talk insofar as a point will emerge from my talk, which is that Dodgeball is not a thing that exists in nature. It doesn't have to be played that way. It is possible to change any rules of any game. It is possible to challenge the narrative that lies underneath any game that we play. For Dodgeball, all we didn't have to do too much to fix it, really. We just add some role play. We could have quite a different game based on quite a different narrative. We could have this. I love this. I made this, so of course I love this. The idea for my Dodgeball game would be that we role play aliens. And the people who are throwing the balls are playing aliens. They're playing at being bad. They don't have to sort of own through their own selves the aggression of being a bully in Dodgeball. An alien is a bad thing. You play the alien, you throw the ball. If you're defending, well, you can be thinking, I'm defending somebody I love, and I'm going to stand in front of these balls and dodge them, but I'll take a ball to protect someone else. All kinds of interesting things. And when you switch roles from throwing the ball to catching the ball to evading the ball, it happens within a different narrative. The thing is that there is no overt role play narrative. That doesn't mean there is no narrative going on in Dodgeball. There's a narrative behind all rules. So challenging or changing rules in the game or in the game of life turns you either into a cheater or a world changer. So you can take into Discord any conversation you want to have about whether Bilbo cheated in the riddle game with Gollum, right, or whatever. Games have rules, and when we change those rules, the world can change. Of course, attempting to change the world's rules is dangerous, pretty fraught. So this image at the top, the Kobayashi Maru, comes from an article, Why You Should Teach Your Students to Cheat. And it basically is arguing that the best thing we can do for our students is to tell them that the world can be changed, and that they can and they may and they should step into the world and challenge rules that they feel are unfair and make attempts to change those rules. Star Trek attempted to change social conventions. This image from this particular episode of this interracial kiss was really shocking at the time to people watching, and good that it was. It was a challenge to social rules which said that this was not okay. Not only not okay on screen, but not okay in the world. So in the era that it came out, there were a lot of things that those of us who make games now were reading and watching and thinking about in those eras. And what they have in common in a variety of ways is that they were making narratives explicit. They were challenging assumptions and presumptions of the majority, challenging them, looking inside them. And I'm not saying all of these were transformative or politically powerful. I'm saying that we were looking at narrative. We were thinking about narrative. We were starting to understand the power of narrative, and we were starting to take some power over narrative. And it's no coincidence that D&D arrived at that moment. And as D&D sort of flowed into culture, it made many of us game designers, not in a professional sense, but just in the sense that we could return to the free play of our childhood, that we were able to, as adults, return to that world of endless horizons, that we could make maps, that we could invite our friends to play in our maps, that we could create worlds and rules and play in them. So my feelings and ideas about this are personal and a little bit professional. I'm interested in how collaborative knowledge happens. How do we learn together? Online, offline? What are the methods by which we collectively remember and collectively tell stories? And I've been influenced by David Turnbull, who's an Australian critical geographer, who studies Indigenous maps of Australian Aboriginal Indigenous maps. and the ways in which they encode story differently than how Western maps encode their values. More about that in a minute. And Turnbull says that telling a story and following a path are cognate activities. We tell a story, we order events in space and time. So storytelling is a form of knowledge making. And likewise, map making is a form of knowledge making. So when we make a map for a game world, for a game that we're making, and we invite people into that world, we have created a collaborative knowledge space. We, as designers and our players together, walking through our maps. And Turnbull comes up with this term, hodology. He calls it freshly emergent. I love that. That's better than obscure, freshly emergent, to link space knowledge and cognition. And if you look up hodology in the Oxford reference, it tells you that it's a study of pathways. So it's a word in use. It's been used by neurologists to understand brain function, the pathways in the brain. It's also used in philosophy, psychology, and geography. And how do I know? How did Oxford Reference know that? Is an interesting question. Well, I think Oxford Reference looked it up in Wikipedia, because Wikipedia also tells us that hodology is a study of pathways. And it lists neuroscience, psychology, philosophy, and geography. But it changes the order in which it reports them. And that's so that we don't think it got it from Wikipedia. Anybody who teaches knows that trick of our students. What you do to make it look like the information you're reporting is not from Wikipedia. Wikipedia is a collaborative knowledge space. Oxford Reference is also, but it's not open in the same way. I have something else to say about Wikipedia, but in a minute. Let me explain how I see hodology. If we just take it to mean the study of pathways, it's a useful term to use for studying a lot of things. The root of the word, again, this is from David Turnbull, he says that the root of the word methodology is the same as the word hodology. It comes from the Greek hodos, the path. Meta meaning after or above. So methodology is a path towards knowledge creation. So we have a study of pathways, we have a path towards knowledge creation. And then I played with this word and invented a word of my own, metahodology. And I used metahodology to refer to the awareness of the narratives that shape the paths through which knowledge is created. And that's a mouthful, and it's easier if I give you an example. So I said I would talk a little bit more about Western maps, and I love maps, I collect maps. This is an interesting map. This is of a county in New Jersey, Kings County. And it shows modern, in whenever this was in the 1800s, modern to the 1800s paths on top of what had been Indian paths, ponds, and places. And as a map goes, that's straightforward. It shows you paths. This is a map of the United States drawn by an indigenous artist. I wish I could tell you who, but it's an anonymous image that is kind of all over the internet, so I don't know the origin of it. It shows North America in the shape of a turtle, which comes from Algonquian and some other indigenous mythologies about our nation, and it is about our continent. I'm sorry, I meant our continent. That our continent is in this shape, and it relates to origin myths and other stories. David Turnbull would say this is a map as much as the one on the left is, And the one on the right, you can easily see and say how it encodes narratives. You see those stories in the map, but what I would want to say is that the map on the left also encodes stories. The story that it encodes is a story about private ownership of land. It's a story about colonization. It's a story about theft. It's a story about justifying that theft. It's a story about the erasure of culture in colonialism. But that narrative is hidden inside this map, which just looks like a map of paths. That's the difference between hodology and metahodology. Metahodology attempts to make transparent those hidden stories, the hidden narrative in an image. So why this is a funny meme and also a politically hard-hitting meme, you understand it or you don't if you understand the narratives behind both the Western map of the United States and the indigenous map of the United States. So I'm going to give you another example, which may be more familiar to you, the Rand-McNally map. So a lot of us grew up before the internet. Some of us here did not grow up before the internet, but for those of us who grew up before you could just put on your GPS and it would tell you where to go, relied on paper maps, and many of us had Rand-McNally maps. And this is an image of the Rand-McNally pocket road map from 1947 in an era when people were hitting the road, the first road trip. And hodologically speaking, the Rand-McNally map shows us where we can go. And that's awesome. There's nothing really deeper than that. Here are the roads, you can go on them. But thinking about the Great American Road Trip metahodologically, meaning if we're aware of the context that shape the paths through which a road trip vacation is created, we have to be aware of these as well. Green books were the books that African Americans had to use if they were going to go on a trip to tell them where it was safe to drive, where it was safe to eat, where it was safe to get gas, where it was safe to sleep. And white America was unaware of the Green Book because the world map, the hodological map, was made for them. That's not explicit because that metahodology is invisible, because we treat maps hodologically, as if they have no narrative, as if they have no context, as if they have no past, right? African Americans understood America metahodologically. They were aware all the time, every day, of the racism that shaped our towns and our cities and our services for tourists. They had to be aware of it because of the dangers in not being aware of it. One of the privileges of being white is that you can live hodologically. You don't have to know or understand. You cannot want to understand the history of why our nation is the way it is. African Americans, Native Americans, let's say people of color, don't have that luxury or that privilege of being unaware of the history of our country. So this was a bad segue, but I said my slides are a little random at the moment. I've been writing about redlining recently. And you may be aware, this is the city of Milwaukee, which is where I grew up. The thing to notice about this map of Milwaukee, right where it says Milwaukee and going east-west is a big white spot, like a big white tab going across. That's the industrial valley. Nobody lives there because it was what it sounds like, an industrial valley full of toxins and industries and terrible smells. And it divided Milwaukee in half, black and white, when I was growing up, and still does to this day. And that begs interesting questions about why. And what I've been looking at are the maps made by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, a federal agency, which collected qualitative and quantitative data for the real estate industry and the banking industry, particularly the banking industry most immediately. They created risk maps showing credit loan risk in cities across America. The process of redlining, I'll explain more about in a second, occurred across the United States because the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which shortens to HOLC, H-O-L-C, did this systematically, this process systematically across the country. We have similar patterns of segregation, housing segregation in major cities all across the United States because of these real estate processes that occurred. And if you're interested in this, just Google University of Richmond Data Science Lab, HOLC maps. Probably if you just put in map, you'll find it. And they have the data behind these maps on cities across America. What the colors mean are the gradations of credit risk. Green areas are the best real estate risk, B, still desirable areas, C, declining areas, and D, hazardous. And how they made these approximations, yes, they did collect some data about the real estate itself, but mostly what they did was find out who was living in these neighborhoods. And if it was white Protestant people living in those areas, they got the grade of A or best. If it was mostly a white Protestant people living in the areas, they would, but there were some maybe immigrants, maybe some Catholic immigrants, or some Jewish people of higher social status, social class, they might be considered still desirable. If they had in them a lot of immigrants, particularly Catholic immigrants or immigrants of color or Jewish people of lower socioeconomic status, these would be considered to be declining. And if there was a majority of non-white people, they would be judged as hazardous. Then when banks used these maps, instead of referring to race, they would refer to the grade of the area, and loans would be denied if you lived in one of these areas. And they could deny that they were making their judgments based on race. So even though the maps were based on race, the loans were based on area. That's a big old lie, right? And this process is called redlining. And what it did in practice was to ensure that despite the New Deal and all this money for people returning, for veterans returning from World War II and other Americans to buy homes, African-American families, even African-American veterans in Milwaukee and across the nation would not get loans. They could not buy homes. Thus, they created negligible capital. They did not pass capital on to their children, as their white citizens were able to do as they bought homes, sold those homes, moved to the suburbs, bought more expensive homes. And the result of this was a concentration of racialized poverty in the inner cities of many, many, many American cities. So, including, I should say, Minneapolis, and I may or may not have included, I found it, but it may not have gotten into here, a picture of Minneapolis, where Minneapolis experienced exactly the same thing, where you have an incredible centralization of homogenization and segregation and extremely white suburbs. It may still be in the deck, I'll come to it. So On August 28th, 1967, the first of 200 marches happened in Milwaukee. For 200 days in a row, the NAACP Youth Council, advised by a Catholic priest, James Grappi, marched from the north side of the city to the south side across the Industrial Valley. There's a series of bridges called viaducts, and they marched across the 16th Street Viaduct, which is often referred to as Milwaukee's Mason-Dixon line. 200 demonstrators met 5,000 white people, many of whom were Polish immigrants, because that was the neighborhood they were marching into. It was a hostile and violent crowd that they met. I have a couple of images of it. This is the march. You can see how many kids, how many children are in this march. There's Father Grappi in the front row there. At this point, the policeman on the right is smiling. But this is what met them on the other side. It became violent. So 5,000 people initially, but this is the second march. This is the second night. So the first night, they fled back, but they returned the next night to an even larger violent crowd. That crowd followed them back across to the north side. Their house was burned down. This is going to sound familiar to you. It was possibly burned by the police, throwing a fire in, saying that they saw, somebody inside with a gun, et cetera, et cetera. The house was burned down, and they continued to march day after day for 200 days. And the anti-open housing foes also marched, and it was pretty clear, what their narrative was. On April 8th, 1968, somewhere between 14,000 and 25,000 people marched down Wisconsin Avenue to honor Martin Luther King Jr. Following in his memory, which was the biggest rights march in the city's history. And on April 11th, 1968, the Civil Rights Act was signed, also known as the Fair Housing Act. It provided for equal housing opportunities regardless of race, religion, or national origin, made it a federal crime to prevent that from happening. And on April 30th, 1968, Milwaukee passed its own open housing ordinance. What changes do you think occurred to the racial housing map of Milwaukee in the 52 years since it became legal for people to live anywhere they wanted in Milwaukee? Well, this is a racial dot map from 2013. And well, it says 2010 on the census, so I'm not sure which this is, 2010 or 2013. But you can see that the white dots are where white people live, the black dot, the green dots are where Black people live. And what you can see is that from the original sort of segregated core, it's actually referred to in Milwaukee as the inner core, where African Americans live in Milwaukee. There was a spread, but it was, in the word of real estate agencies, contained. And the white suburbs around Milwaukee are sometimes referred to as an iron ring. It was not possible for African Americans to move into the suburbs because there were covenants called racial covenants, which if you bought a house in the suburbs, you had to sign saying that you would not sell your house to a Black person, and that the only Black people allowed to live in those places had to be servants, if you can imagine this. Minneapolis also had those covenants. The result of this was that Milwaukee has the lowest rate of African American suburbanization of any metropolitan area in the country. But I'm going to say this, but I'm not going to say it's that much better in other cities in Milwaukee than in the country. It's just that Milwaukee is one of the worst. Only 10% of Black households are in the suburbs, while 80% of white households are in the suburbs in Milwaukee. Oh, here's an example of the wording of a covenant. At no time shall any lot or building be purchased, owned, leased, occupied, or used by any person other than citizens of the United States of the white race. Okay, so that keeps out immigrants who are not white, who are not citizens, obviously, but you still can have domestic servants of those races. And the thing about these covenants is that they were legal documents, so that if you were a homeowner and you sold your home to a Black person, you could be sued. So they were legal documents. This is Minneapolis. I knew I had it. I'm sorry that I don't have the explanation of what colors are what, but as I recall, the green is African-American, and I believe that the red is Asian, and again, the blue is white. So you again see white suburbs surrounding areas where people of color live. There's a cartoon I like, Call Me Paranoid. That sure looks like redlining from here, it says. So social scientists have a metahodological understanding of redlined maps. We know the history of them. We know what's going on in them. So do the people who are being redlined. If you have been redlined and you go to get a loan and they say, I'm sorry, you can't have a loan because of where you live, you know that you've been denied that loan because of the color of your skin. If you try to say that, right, you'll be accused of hysteria or whatever. You'll be gaslighted, basically, because you are being denied because of the color of your skin. So an interesting question arises. Everybody in this comic understands redlining metahodologically. The fat cats with their hats, who are doing it on purpose, the guy drawing the line, and the people who are being redlined. So who doesn't know what's happening with redlining? Who takes that random McNally map hodologically at face value as if it were natural and real? Well, here's BBQ Becky, right? So BBQ Becky, she's a little bit old at this point. She's out of memes at the moment. She's the one who called the police on some people, Black people, being Black while barbecuing, right? So they were just trying to barbecue in the park, and she called the police on them. I mean, there's, I don't know, hundreds of these now that have made it into media, and thousands of these stories that are not in media, just the ones that are filmed that we know about, right? The reason I chose this one is because of this meme. It says at the bottom, now we know who really got Rosa Parks in trouble, right? So somebody who's bothered by Rosa Parks not sitting where she belonged in the back of that bus. And some people are bothered by transgressions of rules which are invisible. So when I teach game design classes, I often talk to my students about the United States, well, any country really, as a game in which the rules are inherently unfair. So we're all living in a game with unfair rules. So when a white woman calls the police and reports a person of color living their lives, the crime she's reporting is that a rule of that social game has been broken. And she assumes that the police will also view it as a crime. And that is often true. And when that's true, and when police are involved who see it that way, people of color can die. Because that's what kind of crime it is in terms of those rules and their history. If you don't know that history, it's not clear that it's anything other than an accident. So if you're viewing the death of an African American by police as an unfortunate accident, you're viewing it hodologically. And if you understand that death as being immediately connected to historical and social events, you're understanding it metahodologically. So Becky here lacks metahodological understanding of the historical context of her own privilege. She doesn't know that those rules were created to support slavery and that then they were maintained to support white supremacy. She only knows that she likes those rules because they privilege her, although she doesn't know she's privileged because she's only viewing the word hodologically. So I want to talk about game design and rule breaking. And some of you came to my talk because you wanted to hear me talk about collaboration. And maybe I'll get to that, but there probably won't be time. I just want to say something about what we can do as game designers. I know that it probably feels to me like this today, that there's nothing I can do, and yet I want to do something, yet anything I do would be inadequate. So we're probably a lot of us in that place today. So as I thought about myself and we, meaning we game designers, narrative writers, I thought, what do we do? What can we do? Not today, not just today. I mean, in our ordinary lives. And I thought that that thing that we can do is break rules. The transformative potential in game design and in teaching and encouraging a kind of free play, like Minecraft, for example, a free play in which kids can make worlds of their own, make them, remake them, collaborate in making them, and have their worlds griefed, right? Sort of the reality that what we make, that we're vulnerable to people who are not trying to make a better world, right? Is the students' realization that the rules governing society are also designed. They were not given by God. Because they were designed, they can be changed. We have to understand the design, we have to understand the history of the design, we have to understand the narrative behind the design. This was a rule-changing moment in Milwaukee, right? The rule was Black people don't cross the 16th Street Viaduct and come to the South Side. This is a big challenge to an unspoken rule in Milwaukee. First, they said the rule out loud. They said, hey, in fact, Father Grappi said this in a speech. He said, hey, I thought it was a free country. I thought that Black people could walk where they wanted to. But when we cross this bridge, you throw bricks, right? You meaning white South Side, right? So they made visible an invisible rule, and then they challenged it. And they, in a way, forced the narrative to be visible. So we also see that happening, actually. When you challenge invisible rules, the narratives emerge. I want to end, and I really have gone back and forth about sharing a personal story because in no way is what's happening in the world about me. So I share this story just maybe to say why I am a game designer. And yeah. This is the grade school I went to first. It's a public grade school. And every time when we played on the playground, every day I used to suggest a different set of rules for the games we were playing. And that's how I understood playing. And then at some point I thought, why am I having all the fun? I thought, why am I doing all the rule changing? And I said, okay, starting tomorrow, we're going to take turns changing the rules of the game. And tomorrow it's your turn, and then it'll be your turn, and then we all can have fun. And the next day dawned, and I said, okay, to my friend, it's your turn. And she just looked at me blankly. And I looked at everybody else and I said, well, who wants to change the rules? And nobody felt comfortable or wanted to or had an idea. I didn't really understand. And one of them said, listen, you just change the rules because we don't know what to do. That's story number one. Story number two, there was a day in 1967 when I was standing on this playground and I watched an African-American man holding the hand of a very small little boy, like pre-kindergarten, kindergarten, walk across the playground. This was a 100% white school on the south side of Milwaukee. I was interested to see this man and this little boy, but was horrified, shocked. What I remember, my memory of this moment is framed by, like, you know how when you stand up too fast and your vision goes brown, like you don't have enough oxygen. My memory of this is surrounded by brown. And I also backed up and hit a fence. So I have a memory of the fence and I have a memory of the brown. And then I have a sense of what happened, which is that the students, my friends, the people around me, picked up rocks and stones and started flinging them at this little boy and his father, and using this word, which I had never heard in my life, but it was extremely ugly how they said it. Then I don't have any memory again until I was at home after school, and I was telling my mother what had happened, and I was crying, and I asked her to explain to me what happened, and she made a mistake. She thought I was asking why people were throwing stones at this man and this boy. And she said to me, Black people are exactly the same as white people. They're equal. They're exactly equal. And I looked at her and I said, why wouldn't they be? That wasn't what I was asking. I was asking, why did the kids go insane? At that moment, I had not connected the kids going insane to the color of skin of the people, right? So in that moment, she told me I was white. That was the moment in which I was told I was white. It was super confusing to me. I just thought the kids were insane. And so she had to actually break me to fix me in that moment. She, I think, understood. She gained her metahodological understanding of that, because the next thing I remember was her going and screaming on the phone. She called the school. Her next call was, I don't know, doesn't matter. It's not about my mom at that moment. But she came back and I was not finished. I said, Mom, why did they do it? And she told me to ask them, because she didn't know. Like, so she acknowledged her failure in that moment. So this was 1967 when probably it was happening in the midst of these demonstrations. I don't know exactly when in the year it happened, so I can't say. She told me to ask them. And the next day I did. I asked them why they had done this horrible thing. And they shrugged. My friends, this was my friends. And they said they didn't know why. It was the rules, they thought, of the game. Their inability to change the rules of a playground game led directly to their inability to even see or understand that the rules of doing something terrible could be changed. And I have more, but I think I want to stop there because that's why it's important that we teach game design, that we teach the simple thing that our world is created by people intentionally, and the rules in the world are created by people intentionally, and that the world is co-created, and that we can step up into that process and remake those rules, but only if we're conscious of the narrative, the history, the social history that led to those rules being in place in the first place. I'll be on the Discord to take questions or comments, but I really don't feel like talking anymore today, honestly. I would rather not talk very much today. I would rather listen. I'd like to encourage a conversation sort of on these theoretical topics, but actually more conversation on a practical suggestions on what people can do to try to make some kind of difference in supporting people of color, changing the rules that pertain to their lives, right? How can we support those conversations and those processes? And I'd like to invite you to join us in that. But I also want to say, if you've made a decision to just stay away from social media today as part of that, we respect that as well. So thank you for listening. Thank you for your time. And I will see you on the Discord.